This is the strategy inside everything. I'm Adam Pierno. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Strategy Inside Everything. We have a very special episode for you today. You're going to really enjoy this. I have Nadia Tuma-Weldon on, and we are going to be looking at luxury. And she's the perfect person to do it because Nadia currently serves as the Global Luxury Practice Lead at McCann World Group and the Global Director of McCann Truth Central. So she serves two roles, does two jobs. It sounds like a lot. Nadia, how are you today?
I'm great, Adam. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for making time to be here. I appreciate it. And I just made a joke about you having two jobs. Tell me a little bit about both of those and tell me how you're able to manage both.
So I do have two jobs, and I've been with McCann World Group for 7 years this month, actually.
That's awesome.
And I've sort of always kept about two roles as I've been there. But we'll start with my day job, which is the global director, one of the global directors of McCann World Group Truth Central. Quite a mouthful, but Truth Central is essentially World Group's global cultural intelligence unit. So we are a small but mighty but global team. And our mission is to create original research about culture. So we have been in existence for 10 years now. And since then, we've been running these big, meaty global studies from both a quantitative and a qualitative standpoint that studies the macro cultural forces that shape how people behave and make decisions. And I think ultimately create relationships with the brands that they buy. And in that time, I mean, we've just amassed millions of data points. Our studies tend to be in over 25 countries, again, both qualitatively and
awesome scale.
So big scale. The data is proprietary, so it's not publicly available. It's not sold. It's really about using and sort of harnessing the research to help our clients' businesses grow. So the reason, the topics that we cover and we study are pretty broad. So we call them truth studies. There's a theme. So all of this comes from McCann's sort of original motto, which is truth well told. And so the idea is that any insight, any campaign, any great creative idea, it all starts from a really compelling human truth. What is this thing that we can understand that's happening in the world? So that's where we come in. We are constantly studying culture, studying human truths. And so our truth studies range from everything from the truth about wellness, sustainability, affluence, beauty, shopping, youth, globalization, all of these big meaty topics. Because, the view that we take is, let's say you work on like an auto brand, for better or for worse, and it's no fault of anyone working on it, you sort of talk about human beings as if they live in a world of automobiles. Like
right. You can't help but contextualize everything to that vertical, to that space.
Totally. So they're like, no one sort of, as much as we'd like to think, nobody's waking up saying, I wonder what Toyota's up to today. Not to call out Toyota, right? You wake up and you're like, where are my kids? What am I doing? How's my health? How's my finances? What's happening in the news and the politics and all this?
You're not thinking about brand pillars, that's for sure.
You're not thinking about where in the purchase funnel you are, and which, millennial vector is, making your heart sing, right? So I think we try to really challenge a lot of those marketing tropes. Even things like regions, which are like completely random. Like, how is MENA a region? That's Middle East and North Africa.
Are you empowered to break down those questions and to uncover the truth behind the truth? Or
100%.
Are you trying to, I've seen agencies and research orgs that sort of have an editorial position and all the research they do seems to reinforce it. Are you guys free to, your findings are your findings and the truth is truth?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So we work with basically every geography and every type of client, but we are not tied to any of them. So our work literally is the truth. It is what the data says. Obviously we interpret it as sort of cultural anthropologists, I guess you could sort of call our group. But yeah, we take everything and challenge it. We take age demographics and challenge them. We take marketing regions and challenge them. And, I'll get to that in just a moment, sort of how we do that. But I think it's, I'm happy at the end of the day if I can come in with the findings from our research, which is deeply human, like team human, like that is our team. That's where we play. And if I can come in and show the world in a way that can change a client's view of the world by like 3 degrees, that's success. Because a lot of our big clients, like they see a ton of research, and most of it is sort of traditional market research or sort of research from agencies that are very smart, but don't have that proprietary data. They're kind of doing the Forrester and the Mintel and the Google and like smart people in a room, which is incredibly important. But
it's a lit review.
Sorry?
It's a lit review. It's not proprietary. It's not organically discovered truths.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we come to each topic saying, listen, like I am not the only person studying age. I'm not the only person studying wellness by any stretch of the imagination. So what can I say about this topic that is true, but different, but is fresh and is interesting and makes people like kind of sit up and look at the world a little bit differently. So that's what I was brought in to do. And I think the global nature of it is also another thing that sets us up. So we have contacts in basically every country where McCann is, which is I think most countries.
Yeah.
And those people help us contextualize the research, run the qualitative that we do, which we tend to make really fun. Like we try to, we like go into people's houses in 100 countries and look at their bathroom cabinets for the truth about wellness. We hold big dinner parties with wealthy people for the truth about affluence, in their homes on their own turf. So we try to make the data sort of meet with these like really human stories. And the people in all of these countries really help us. Or we'll get like a weird data point. We're like, why is Brazil so odd for this question? And we'll call up that person and they can help us make sense of it. So that global connectivity is really important. So I came into McCann and I was starting to lead these studies. And I think about 2 years in, I was leading a big piece of research called The Truth About Globalization. I co-authored it with the woman who founded Truth Central. And as a result of that, we sort of took that study on the road. Like we do these launch events that are really immersive and interesting. And we kind of
we try to bring it to life.
And try to bring it to life, try to localize it. So if you have a launch in Paris, it's the French sort of cultural interpretation of those global findings, right? So there's always going to be the universal human truths, the things that are just everywhere, and bind humanity together. And then it's really about, well, how is this expressed in the Philippines? And how is this expressed in South Africa? And what does this look like in India? And you start to get like essentially 30 versions of that one study because you're able to localize it so effectively.
That's cool.
So yeah, it's really cool. It's a great, interesting job that keeps me interested because you have to be thinking about the world all the time.
You're going to have to share some of those studies with me. I know they're not for sale, but I mean, you can, come on.
I can share some summaries with you for
There's no video with this podcast, but listeners, you should know that her face indicated there is no way on earth I am getting access. She gave me a look. I was like, what are you talking about? Nadia, come on, we're bros now. I thought for sure.
For the right price.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, so I, for this one piece of research specifically, I started to get on the road, and I was actually spending quite a bit of time going to launch these studies in Asia, which I had never been to before, but was totally obsessed with, sort of, in the ideal of my Western mind. And as I started to do that, I started to work with the teams, and it was really good, and we were getting along, and the studies were looking really great, and so there was this sort of conversation around, well, would you want to come live here and maybe help, I think a two-way street. One was to help bring the Truth Central sort of way of thinking to the offices and the people in our Asia locations, but also I think from our headquarters is New York City, right? And another global hub is London. And so it's very Western, and we talk about Asia. I mean, even just saying Asia is like laughable, right? I mean, it's so diverse and so rich. So even having being a sponge essentially by living there and being able to speak with relative fluency on like, well, this is why Indonesia is different from Malaysia. And like, you could never call them a region, which is Southeast Asia, right? So I obviously was not going to be able to do that job from New York City. So I went and I lived in Asia for 2 years and did that role. So that was my second job within McCann.
You're committed to just overdoing it no matter what.
Totally. So that was an incredible experience. It was super transformative personally and professionally. It was amazing, basically running around the region, just having like a crash course.
It sounds
in
incredible.
Cultural fluency. When asked what my next second job would be, I came up with this idea of creating this global luxury practice. And the global luxury practice is essentially this network of experts that I created that come from all over the world. So we have people from Tokyo all the way down to San Francisco, like that, those entire time zones. And what we do as a practice, our goal is to redefine and recast what the culture of luxury means for a modern era. And so we know that luxury has a lot of baggage as a term, but that we know that in the past 10 years, it has completely changed. But in the last 10 months, it's sort of accelerated beyond recognition, right? And the idea that luxury is exclusionary and high priced and white and Western and all these things is just something of the past. And we really want to understand what is a modern new view of luxury that is aware and inclusive and expansive and looks different and feels different for this new generation that's coming up. And so that's what our mission is. And that's what we sort of work towards.
And how does the Truth Central work overlap? There must be a lot of overlap in the research, but I'm assuming the Truth Central work is not specific to luxury per se, unless that's where the topic takes you or where the research takes you.
Yeah, there is overlap. I think, we have affluence work that we do. I've done quite a bit of qualitative research, paradoxically, on a shoestring to get luxury insights, through, talking to different people or kind of hacking my way into figuring out how to get to speak with wealthy individuals, et cetera, or people who are just doing interesting things in the space. But I think the biggest thing is that I take a Truth Central approach to luxury. So everything I sort of said about how we think about culture in the world, we sort of take that mindset and really explode it within luxury to get to new ways of looking at it that can keep pace and almost, be ahead of culture, ideally.
How did you get there? How did your brain start making that connection? Versus because a lot of people are attracted to the artifacts of luxury, but not the drivers of it, I guess, or the insights behind it. What drove you? What pulled you to that, do you think?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Well, I think it might go back a little bit to my upbringing. To some extent, I have my parents are immigrants. They're from Lebanon, and there's a very specific sort of culture that comes with that. I grew up in America, but I sort of split my growing up time between America and France. So I've spent a lot of time there. And I think there's this very specific culture that comes with French culture. And I think there's also this part of me that has always been obsessed with understanding human behavior. So this idea of when I was in university studying something called decision science, which was all about understanding how people make decisions and why people make decisions. And usually those decisions have nothing to do with rationality. They have everything to do with emotion. And
yeah,
so,
we have no idea why we do what we do.
Exactly. And even if we're told like, oh, well, you bought this thing because you were depressed or you felt empty or you had a great day, people are like, come on.
No, I bought it because it's 12.9 fluid ounces. That's why. What a deal.
Yeah. And I went from awareness to consideration in the purchase funnel. So, I think, this whole, so basically this was something that I always thought about. And then when I, at some point in my career, I worked in consulting. It was brand consulting. And I wasn't very happy doing that job. I wasn't very fulfilled. And in my free time, I just started writing in a blog, like this little funny blog that I had that was just all about image and aspiration and luxury. And I would just sort of funnel all my creative energy into that piece of work, which was about 10 years ago. So it took me almost 10 years to get the job. But so I think that just was part of this lifelong curiosity about human behavior. And I think if you think about luxury, it almost is this sort of like really condensed set of this like condensed expression of aspiration, right? It's like aspiration just bundled into one concentrated space. And if you can almost understand the culture of luxury, you can understand all aspiration, because it's sort of the finest, most sharp articulation of what aspiration looks like.
That's, I wanted to talk to you about, so I've had futurists on over the past few months. I've had people talk about luxury, but I noticed that you have done some work looking at where luxury might be headed. And in this weirdness that we're all in, I wanted to hear your thoughts on where you see luxury potentially going. And then we can kind of work backwards towards root causes that like of what we're all experiencing that might be driving some of those things.
Yeah. There's so much to start to unpick.
I know this could be an 18-hour conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I think you also need to start even with the fundamental of how does one define luxury? What does luxury mean to someone? Where in the world do you live? What are the experiences around you? I think the one thing that I go back to quite often, and we can just start somewhere and kind of go from there. There's so much that we could start to unpick when it comes to this topic. But I had read somewhere once that 90% of all human behavior can be attributed to signaling. And, signaling is, of course, some kind of external signal to a stranger, someone or whatever, that says something about who you are. And when I started to think about luxury, even just right after the lockdown started to happen here in New York, very quickly you saw a pretty drastic elimination of the sort of classic influencer model, right? Where here's my second home, here's my bling, here's my car, here's my whatever. I think some influencers were slightly tone deaf, and some celebrities as well. I think that it's been well reported about how some celebrities were complaining about being stuck at home in their mansions and things like that, right? And so they were very quickly vilified, those who did that. But I think most people like this knew pretty quickly that it was going to be in poor taste to do any kind of privilege, showing things off, as particularly in New York, people were dying, and then following that, there still is a lot of economic hardship. Mm-hmm. But what I did notice was on a more sort of quotidian level, like just sort of normal lay people, that signaling still existed. It was still going on. And, so you would see things like people posting photos, thank goodness they don't do this anymore, posting photos of like a Zoom happy hour, on Instagram to show, listen, I'm still in demand. I'm still a person that is social and connected and popular.
Yeah, that didn't I remember that phase of the first month of people doing things like that. And I mean, now it's like Zoom happy hour, please don't invite me to that. But in that first month, it was like, oh, okay, yes, my social life, my social status still remains even despite all that's happening.
Right. And what other reason to post a photo of a screen on another screen than to signal that you're still, thriving. So, I think fortunately or unfortunately, part of human behavior is to signal and to show certain things. Now, I think that's a universal human truth that doesn't change. It's been around. I was just sort of writing a little piece about how I went to the Met Museum, and there was this hall that was all about ancient Rome, and there was this whole section about like luxury in ancient Rome. And you read it, and it read as if it could have been written last year, just about the way people wanted to adorn themselves, or the way that they thought about importing goods, or the way that, there was exploitation of people, all of these certain things that I think they're just universal. They've always been, they always will be. Now, what I find most interesting is the nuance. So how does it change, right? So if showing certain things about status,
if those things are constant,
they're
then
constant.
What's changed?
They're a drumbeat. How is that activated? How do we understand that better? So, you know, my group that studies luxury, we're a global group. And I think when you start to dig into the different cultural contexts, it starts to get really interesting and really powerful. Because I think ultimately, when you think about human behavior, you are a product of your context. Even in New York. So I sort of posited this theory that, you know, it's going to be in really bad taste to walk around with a brand new expensive luxury handbag, or to drive around in a brand new luxury car. And I think for the most part, that's true. But then on said Met Museum visit, my husband and I were on the Upper East Side, and we went out to lunch afterwards, and people walking around were like totally, you know, adorned in all the logos and all these things, because it's a safe space there for people to be doing that, right? So I think it really depends on your context. I think, again, as I mentioned, our team's quite global, so we have a few experts in luxury who live in China, and in China there's a tremendous amount of trust in the government. The government has, you know, essentially made the COVID pandemic kind of like a bad memory that happened over the summer, and people have moved on. It is the bright spot in luxury because of that. You know, people feel a sense of optimism, they feel a sense of trust. There's huge lines at the Louis Vuitton store in Shanghai, you know, that's back to that.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So you're going to have those sorts of differing pieces around that. Now, what I would say has been really heartening, I think, and it's not something that is new, but I think has been accelerated by the pandemic, has been this real need for luxury brands to be responsible, to be inclusive, to be aware, to be expansive. You know, there's this great quote I heard at a conference in January, which seems like 14 years ago. Yeah. It was from the CEO of Tiffany's, and this was right before the sale to LVMH was announced, before recently it was unannounced. But he said, you know, people are now coming to luxury with questions. Yes, it's beautiful on the outside, but is it beautiful on the inside? And I think this whole projection around, you know, millennials and Gen Z by 2030 and 2040 are going to be the biggest proportion of luxury consumers in the world. They have those expectations, and they want to see themselves reflected in campaigns. They want to see brands acting in ways that are meaningful, and not sort of old, exclusionary, precious, rarefied.
Wait, but this is interesting, because when you asked earlier, what is luxury? As you're describing luxury brands being more inclusive and more expansive and covering more ground, what I start to hear is that if they're including more people, then they're less precious. So how do you reconcile both of those things if they are? I mean, certainly you're not going to see those brands come to the McDonald's territory, but I triggered something.
Well, I think that's a really interesting provocation. So we do an initiative I started about 6 years ago called the Tastemakers Council. And the Tastemakers Council is a gathering of a variety of innovators and thought leaders in the luxury space. And we bring them together for a big experiential dinner where we talk about co-creating the future of luxury. And we talk about the forces that we think are defining luxury and affluence in the future. And the last of these that we held was in November, of course, right before everything changed. But one of the big themes that came out of that conversation was like, can we ever define luxury? Is there a way to ever put like a definitive, this is what luxury is and this is what it means? And I think to our earlier point about these enduring truths, but understanding how they shift and shape over time, the theme that came out was that luxury is this powerful combination of love and skill. And love and skill, those two together is what makes luxury. So whether it's a love for craft and a skill for people, or it's a love for solving a problem and a skill for creating a product, or it's a love for joy, and it's, so you start to kind of understand these ways of mixing and matching. And I think then you can understand, okay, well, if I'm a brand and I'm a luxury brand, and I think about what love really means in my context, in the context of what I do, and I have this skill. So when you think about, for instance, direct-to-consumer brands, and many of these brands sort of tout themselves as modern luxury brands. A lot of them, like, they might have the love like really high, but maybe the skill is a bit lower. Like the product isn't as wonderful, or the skill is really high, like incredible technical skill, but the love and the care and that sort of personalization and that isn't there, right?
It's technically perfect, but there's no soul.
Totally. And just like music, we know that if you play a technically perfect sonata on the piano, but there's no soul to it, it's going to fall flat. Or you can play absolutely beautifully, but if you're making mistakes all over the place, like it's not you won't be able to listen to it.
Or it's jazz.
Or it's quote unquote jazz. So I think within that context, we've been using that a lot as a North Star in how we think about things. And, when you mentioned McDonald's, I think that really sort of lit something up in me, because I've been thinking a lot about new luxury and what that means in the context of including new voices and including people of different shapes and sizes and colors and experiences, which I think if you're not thinking about that as a luxury brand, you're not going to survive, because this is your customer. And if it's not your customer, it's a customer that cares because they have friends of that. So there's a brand that I've been sort of obsessing over lately. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're called Telfar. So Telfar has also been dubbed sort of on the street as the Bushwick Birkin. So they make I know it now. Keep going. Yeah. I thought you would. You seem pretty tapped in.
Definitely not, but I know that one.
What I love about this brand is that they are considered a luxury brand, even though their tagline is, "It's not for you, it's for everyone." And what they have done is they've turned every single trope of the luxury model on its head. And, one of the things that they do, which it was funny, I was actually talking to a reporter about this brand recently, and I said, it reminds me a little bit of like what John Galliano was doing in the 90s. Before there was all this money and this huge machine, and it was just raw creativity, and he just used his friends to help put on shows. And
this is what I'm going to do, and it's going to be what I want it to be.
And it is love and it is skill, like in spades. And I think sometimes both of those things can get diluted when you throw too much money or sort of influence and power or conglomerate at it. And so what's been really interesting about Telfar is that, he grew up in Queens, and he grew up kind of going to White Castle and going to,
I'm looking at the White Castle
uniforms
collab now. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. What is happening?
What I love about it, he was like, "Oh, you want a piece of that collaboration? Well, you got to get a job at White Castle," and because this was and first of all, this brand has been around for like 10 years. So it's not that they're brand new. I think they're coming to prominence now because the cultural moment, they're sort of rising to the cultural moment.
Yeah.
But, the idea that they just needed some funding, and they're like, well, we like White Castle, so maybe they can do it. And what I find so amazing is that, they had one of their runway shows, and then the vice president of White Castle said, well, why don't you have the after party at our restaurant in Times Square? And they were like, that's awesome. And we won't even have a guest list. Anyone can come. And it was the biggest party, the most wanted party in all of Fashion Week. And you had literally the vice president turning on and off the lights. So it would be like a strobe. And people were just filling up soda. I mean, but how delightful and joyful. Like that to me is what luxury should be. I don't think luxury should be this like stiff, unflexible thing that that doesn't feel like joy and beauty. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, there's room for both.
Yeah.
There's room
absolutely.
for both. There are certainly some of the enduring brands that are rigid in their expression. Some of those will thrive and evolve further into that direction. But that example of Telfar and some others, there's room for that love and that inclusivity. I wonder how much It's kind of like, who was the designer that did the DHL?
Vetements.
Yeah, like you can get away with that one time and still be luxury. I don't think you can go back to that well a second time and before you're like, yeah, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's kind of like the Gap, you know?
Yeah, and why am I paying $7,000 for an IKEA bag?
Right. Right.
You know, no one's paying $7,000 for anything right now.
And that's the question about inclusivity. There's a way to signal that, and there's a way to do it intentionally with real meaning behind it. And I wonder how far do you think brands can push it before it goes, where's the line between coveted and too accessible?
Oh, that is the eternal question, Adam. I think there's this really interesting conversation around that's going on right now around the luxury resale market. So I don't know if you saw in the past week, Gucci partnered officially with the Real, which is a luxury consignment company that's doing some great things.
They're doing great things, but they're also bridging the gap. And some of those brands, if they become too easy to get through something like that, I think it diminishes their brand.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. So here's my perspective on that. You know, so you have the Gucci on the one end, and you know, Alessandro Michel is like amazing, right? He's transformed that brand. He's done a ton in sustainability. He's super smart. He surrounds himself with like Gen Z and millennials anyway. So he's hearing from, you know, the customers that most, not only most purchase him, but are also the future, the company. And then on the other hand, you have Chanel, who is very skeptical of the resale model. And there's a couple of lawsuits out, I think, between Chanel and the Real around counterfeit and maybe not valuing things. And I think what's interesting is I tend to think that a lot of that is driven more by the brands than by the people. So if you think about a Chanel, like the amount of money that they pour into their marketing, into their runway shows, like they held a legitimately major fashion show in Paris Fashion Week just a couple of weeks ago. So they're putting all this money in. And honestly, Chanel to me is still one of the most amazing luxury brands, just in the way that they operate, in the way that they create content, in the way they bring you into their universe, in the way that they uphold Mademoiselle Coco Chanel as sort of, you know, this specter that guides everything that they do. But you have to understand, they think if we're pouring all this money and we have these incredibly high prices, the Real, for instance, is going to denigrate our brand. Again, I think that's the company really being strict about control over their image. But I think if we've learned one thing about the shift in luxury is that traditional luxury, old luxury, is that the luxury brand sets the thing that everyone aspires to. They say, this is what you need to aspire to. You need to come to us. What we're seeing now is that it's the people who are setting and defining what luxury means for them. And it's the brands that now have to come down and speak to the people, and not come down in like a derogatory way, but come meet them. And so you see really smart brands like Gucci doing that. I think Chanel does a really good job in some of their other ways, like their beauty products are more accessible and feel luxurious, and they're kind of coming to a customer and making her feel like an expert and that she has taste and things like that. But I think that the idea of people buying $8,000 jackets right now is probably not a reality. And the idea of buying something that is already in the production system, it is not made new. We don't need more stuff. There's enough stuff that is produced to let everyone survive for the next 50 years if we never made another thing. You know, I think there's a real pride that people feel when they get something that feels responsible. There's a story behind it. I think people like to say like, yeah, oh, you like this? It was secondhand, you know, and I got this great deal on it. Isn't it beautiful? And isn't it, you know, and you have a story around it. I wonder what the woman who wore it before, what her life was like, you know, and you start to kind of have these things be passed down. They almost become like heirlooms, you know? So I think it's a complicated thing, but there's a huge desire for traditional luxury brands to hold on to that creative control and thus say, no, our prices need to be really, really high. But I think the reality of the world now is that you will have your high value customers who are sort of recession proof, who will buy these things regardless. But I think more and more people are going to be thinking, what is sustainable? What is inclusive? What is a way that I can get this sort of this beautiful thing, but mix it into the way that I like to live my life, and create it something that's totally me and totally different.
That's very interesting. Do you think there will be more brands that come and find that path into diversifying their distribution so that their wares can be found through a variety of channels and not just the ones they control, and making that secondhand or alternate connection possible?
Yeah, I mean, you're starting to see it. I think a lot of brands, again, there's a control issue, but I think if they have control over it, this isn't necessarily like a traditional luxury brand, but if you think about Levi's, which has always been a pretty strong proponent of the environment and a custodian, especially denim being one of the most destructive materials to make in the world. They recently launched a sister site that's like secondhand vintage, and you can go on that site and you can just buy up, older vintage Levi's. And I think there's a real cachet to that. There's almost more of a cachet to say you've got something vintage or secondhand, or you did a little searching for something, than to just say, you know what, I clicked on a thing and I bought it because it had some money. But at the same time, I mean, to that point, I think there's so much more to this conversation than the product, because to me, there's a difference between, I'm going to go on the Cartier website and I'm going to buy a pair of earrings, whatever.
That doesn't do it. That's 10% of the experience of going into the Cartier store, right, and having that experience of asking somebody to pull the thing out from the case or reach up and grab it from the shelf, and experiencing that moment where they unveil it for you, and
they give you the champagne, and you have their business card, and they, and you have the story of there's a reason the Cartier is a mansion on Fifth Avenue, because it has all this history, and Grace Kelly was there and all these things.
Right.
But the real, I mean, now, there's an interesting conversation to be had about the role of retail stores. And I think the role of a retail store is actually going to be exactly to double down on that experience, because you can sort of get anything online now. And so even what the Real has done, and I swear I'm not like a spokesperson for them, I think what they're doing is very interesting. In their stores, first of all, they look beautiful. So you walk by and you don't think consignment. You walk by and think, ooh, that looks interesting. But they also were really good about curating events. And so you would have, leaders in sustainability do these like panel discussions to talk about the impact your clothing has in the world. Or they'd have interesting designers come in and curate a collection for you and talk about why, we should be not buying a bunch of new clothes all the time and all these things. So I think it's going to be more about the process than the product in a lot of ways, whether that's, I'm going to go to a really fine, handsome luxury store and I'm going to interact with the salesperson in a really meaningful way, or I'm going to buy this product, but there's this really interesting sustainability or inclusion story around it that's going to be something I can tell my friends about.
So it'll be more about finding a meaning or injecting a meaning into the way you got it, potentially, or adding context to it versus just that click and own mentality that Amazon has trained us all into.
Yeah, and Amazon's trying to get, they've tried and tried and tried to get into the luxury space, and they keep trying, and it just fails to stick. And I think it's a great opportunity to say, you just can't buy your way into luxury. You just have to have some love and skill that supports it.
Well, what do you think they could do? I was just about to say that this has been a good conversation, but now I'm intrigued. Let's talk about Amazon for 2 seconds. What do you think they could do better? Because you're right. I think they've had 5 failed attempts and they're trying again now. And every time it's like, this time it's going to be the time. Sure. Not buying it. But what do you think is the missing ingredient for them? Why do they keep swinging and missing?
I mean, I don't want to say like this, hey, this is what Amazon needs to do for it to work. But I think there's probably a couple of really key reasons why it doesn't work. I think the first thing is that the minute you start to stock or have a relationship with Amazon, you are effectively cut off from your customer. So you basically don't have the ability to look at the data, to have that sort of one-on-one conversation with your customer. And I think that's really important. And there's why I think there's a very well-trodden set of lists of brands that have refused to sell on Amazon for that reason. And I think, quite frankly, there's a negative brand rub. If you're a luxury brand and you have an Amazon in front of you, it just simply denigrates the brand, unfortunately.
It's the opposite of the real.
Yeah.
It's not additive.
Right.
So
exactly.
It's because you can just add to cart or buy now, it removes any of that context or meaning that people are seeking in those things.
That's right.
Interesting. Well, this is great, Nadia. This was a fascinating conversation for me to pick your brain on that topic. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for having me.
Where can people find you online?
Where can you find me? I'm not, unfortunately, a very active social media human. I try to be.
Good for you. But this has been wonderful. Thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Strategy Inside Everything is produced by me, Adam Pierno. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcast. It really helps. If someone shared this with you and you're just not sure where you could find it, you can go to specific.substack.com and sign up there to get episodes before everybody else. For more information about me, Adam Pierno, you can go to adampierno.com. There's information about my books, my speaking, and my strategy work. Have an idea for a guest? Send it my way. Just go to adampierno.com and you'll find a form there that'll help you connect. Thanks for listening.